more in 6 months than almost any administration could accomplish in 8 years, and we're going to have a lot of good 6 months left. We're going to have a 6 and another 6 and another 6, so we'll keep going.
President Trump has succeeded in getting institutions to bend to his will, whether it's Congress, the courts, law firms, universities, and media companies, often with threats that force obedience among even some of his sharpest critics. But what does the American public think about the president's unprecedented use of his executive power? Well, brand new CNN polling out for the first time right now offers a new warning sign for Trump on his bedrock issue.
For the first time, a majority of Americans are saying something that just a year ago would have been unthinkable, that President Trump's deportation crackdown has gone too far. What was once one of his strongest political weapons, immigration enforcement, is now becoming one of his biggest vulnerabilities. Poll numbers are shifting fast, stories of families being torn apart are sparking outrage, and even some of Trump's most loyal supporters are beginning to ask, wait, who exactly are we? Targeting here, Trump promised to restore law and order, but with deportations expanding at lightning speed, from Venezuelan migrants sent to El Salvador's prisons to thousands of ordinary workers suddenly facing removal, Americans are starting to question whether this is about safety or about power. And that raises a bigger, more unsettling question. Has Trump finally crossed a line that even his own base might not follow him across? When Donald Trump walked into the White House, he didn't just step into power, he seized it. In just 6 months, he managed to do what many presidents struggle to achieve in 4 or even 8 years. From Congress to the courts, from universities to the media, Trump found ways to bend America's most powerful institutions to his will. How did he do it? Not by carefully negotiating or quietly persuading. Instead, Trump used force, pressure, and public threats that left even his toughest critics scrambling. Lawmakers who once vowed to stand against him suddenly fell in line. Judges who questioned his authority faced blistering attacks on national television. Media outlets, law firms, and even universities felt the weight of a president who wasn't afraid to push boundaries. That IT was a show of raw power unlike anything modern America had seen. Trump made it clear compromise wasn't his style, domination was. And to many of his supporters, this was exactly the kind of leadership they had been waiting for, bold, unapologetic, and ruthless. But this aggressive approach came with a price. Because while Trump was winning battles inside Washington, outside the Capitol, the American public was beginning to wonder, how far is too far? When does tough leadership start to look like overreach? And nowhere was that question louder than on Trump's signature issue, immigration. For years, immigration was supposed to be Trump's strongest card, the issue that fired up his base and gave him leverage over his opponents. But now, the numbers tell a very different story. That a brand new CNN poll delivered a shock. Only 42% of Americans approve of how Trump is handling immigration overall. And when it comes to deportation specifically, that number drops even lower, just 40% support his approach. The real bombshell? A clear majority, 55% of Americans, now believe Trump's deportation policies have gone too far. That's not just disapproval, that's a tipping point, and it isn't a slow, gradual slide. Just a few months earlier, those numbers looked very different. In fact, the disapproval has jumped by nearly 20 points since February. Something in Trump's strategy set off alarms with the American people, and they're reacting fast. So, what exactly happened between then and now? Why did public opinion turn against policies that once seemed untouchable? The answer lies in a series of controversial decisions that shook even some of Trump's most loyal allies. The real turning point came when Trump unleashed one of his most aggressive moves yet. In March, he invoked sweeping wartime authority, a rarely used legal power, to deport Venezuelan migrants straight into prisons in El Salvador. And on paper, it sounded like a bold strike against dangerous criminals. But when details emerged, the reality looked very different. Among those deported were people with no violent history at all, workers, students, and ordinary residents caught up in the dragnet. Some had nothing more on their record than traffic violations or unresolved immigration paperwork. The backlash was immediate and fierce. And It wasn't just from Democrats or immigrant rights activists. Even prominent Trump supporters started to question what was happening. Joe Rogan, a figure with a huge conservative audience, openly criticized the move on his podcast, warning that innocent people were being swept up under the banner of public safety. Suddenly, the narrative began to shift. Instead of projecting strength, Trump's deportation machine looked reckless, chaotic, and dangerously overreaching. What was once seen as a promise to protect America was now raising unsettling questions. Were these really dangerous criminals being deported? Or was the government targeting anyone it could catch, no matter how minor the offense? And just as the dust began to settle, Trump doubled down with an even more controversial move, one that sent shockwaves around the world. If March raised eyebrows, then April and May blew the doors wide open. Trump's team pushed deportations even further, not just to nearby countries, but to far-flung places like South Sudan and other unstable regions across the globe. Almost overnight, legal battles erupted. Immigration lawyers, humanitarian groups, and even some federal judges sounded alarms. Was the administration following the law? Or was it stretching authority beyond recognition? At the same time, billions of taxpayer dollars were being funneled into ICE, supercharging its operations like never before. New detention centers, expanded raids, and a faster deportation pipeline promised one thing: more removals, more quickly with fewer questions asked, but with that acceleration came chaos. Families were separated in the middle of the night. People with no criminal records found themselves on planes to countries they hadn't seen in decades. Reports surfaced of deportees sent to regions so dangerous that even U.S. officials had previously avoided transfers there. And yet, inside the White House, Trump's allies celebrated. They saw this as proof that the president was keeping his promise, moving faster and harder on immigration than anyone before him. But outside Washington, ordinary Americans began to see something different, a crackdown spiraling out of control. And that raises a critical question: was all of this making America safer or simply tearing communities apart? As the crackdowns intensified, the numbers began to tell a sobering story. A majority of Americans now say Trump's immigration policies are not making the country safer. In fact, 53% believe the United States is less secure because of the way these deportations are being carried out. And when asked if the federal government is carefully following the law during deportations, nearly 6 out of 10 Americans said no. That's not a small margin, that's a crisis of confidence. But the statistics only tell part of the story. Across the country, people began witnessing scenes that didn't fit the tough-on-crime narrative. A farm worker pulled from the fields, a landscaper taken from a suburban neighborhood, mothers and fathers separated from their children over minor violations. These weren't the violent offenders Trump had promised to remove. They were neighbors, coworkers, and community members. The images spread fast on social media, in local news, and in the stories people shared with friends and family. And the more people saw, the more uneasy they became. Even those who once said they supported tough immigration enforcement started asking, is this really what we signed up for? For Trump, this was dangerous territory, because once doubt begins to spread, even among those who backed him, it's hard to control the narrative. And that's exactly what was starting to happen, a slow but powerful shift in public opinion. But the real test came not from Democrats or independents. It came from inside Trump's own party. For years, Republicans rallied behind Trump's immigration agenda. It was the issue that energized the base, the rallying cry at campaign stops, and the policy that defined his presidency. But even here, the ground has started to shift. Yes, most Republican voters still say they support Trump's deportation policies. The party's leadership continues to defend him loudly, painting the crackdowns as necessary and long overdue. But inside focus groups and private conversations, a different picture emerges. Over and over, Republican voters have admitted something they rarely say out loud. I don't mind deporting criminals, but the farm worker down the road, the landscaper I see every week, the woman who's been cleaning houses in my neighborhood for years, that feels different. This is where Trump's strength becomes his weakness. The base loves the idea of being tough on immigration, but the reality of seeing ordinary, nonviolent people taken away is harder to stomach. It doesn't look like strength anymore. It looks personal. It looks cruel. And yet, Trump still holds immense leverage. Because even with doubts rising, a majority of Republicans continue to side with him. And as long as that base remains loyal, Trump knows he can pressure Congress, silence critics inside his party, and keep pushing forward. But the divide is growing, quietly, slowly, but unmistakably. And if history has shown anything, it's that once cracks appear inside a political movement, they can spread fast. The question now wasn't just whether independents and Democrats would turn against Trump. That was already happening. The real danger was whether his own supporters might one day decide that his version of law and order had gone too far. And while immigration was the flashpoint, it wasn't the only area where Trump's numbers were sliding. His troubles went deeper, straight into the heart of the economy. Immigration may have been Trump's calling card, but the economy was supposed to be his safety net, the issue that would always keep him afloat. He built his brand on being a deal maker, a businessman who knew how to create jobs and outsmart foreign competitors. For many voters, even those who disagreed with him on other issues, the economy was the reason they stuck by him. But the latest polling shows even that foundation starting to crumble. Just 40% of Americans now approve of Trump's handling of the economy. That number is devastating because if a president can't convince the public that he's improving their wallets, then all the political victories in the world won't matter. The problem is bigger than numbers on a page. Americans are living it every day. Tariffs that Trump promised would punish other countries are instead raising prices at home, effectively a hidden tax on U.S. consumers. Groceries, household goods, and even farm equipment have all become more expensive. Farmers who once cheered Trump's tough talk on trade now face shrinking markets and growing debt. And behind closed doors, even many Republicans admit they're uneasy. The GOP has long prided itself on supporting free markets and opposing heavy tariffs. But Trump is threatening to upend that tradition with massive, punishing import taxes if countries refuse to bend to his trade demands. If those negotiations fail, and Trump follows through on his threats, the economic pain could hit hard and fast. For voters, it raises an uncomfortable question. If Trump's immigration policies aren't making the country safer, and his economic policies aren't making life cheaper, then what exactly are Americans gaining from all this chaos? That's why when historians look back, this moment may stand out. Because for the first time in his presidency, Trump isn't just underwater on one issue. He's underwater on nearly all of them. And compared to other presidents at the same point in their terms, Trump's numbers look even more alarming. When you step back and look at the bigger picture, the warning signs become even clearer. At this point in their presidencies, most modern presidents were still riding a wave of goodwill. Voters tend to give new leaders time, hoping their promises will eventually pay off. But Trump is breaking that pattern. His approval rating, sitting at just 42%, is worse than nearly every president in recent memory. In fact, only Trump himself, back in 2017, had numbers this low. And unlike then, this time he can't blame inexperience or a chaotic transition. He's been in power long enough to show results, and the public has seen enough to judge him. That judgment is not flattering. On immigration, on the economy, and even on his massive domestic spending bill, Trump is underwater. Each policy that was meant to showcase strength has instead raised questions about overreach legality and effectiveness, and here's the most telling part. History shows that when presidents overplay their hand in the first months of power, there's almost always a backlash. One-party control often leads to overreach, and overreach almost always leads to voter revolt. The public grows restless. Supporters grow hesitant. Opponents grow louder. That's where Trump stands now. He's still strong enough to dominate his party, but his standing with the broader public is slipping fast. And once those cracks start to widen, even the most powerful leaders can find themselves cornered. The question looming over Washington isn't whether Trump has achieved a lot in a short time. He has, The question is whether he's already pushed too far, too fast, and whether history will remember these months as the peak of his power or the beginning of his decline. In just 6 months, Trump has proven he can wield power like few presidents before him. He's bent institutions to his will, supercharged deportations, and reshaped the national conversation on immigration. On paper, it looks like strength, but out in the real world, the picture is far less clear. Polls show Americans are losing faith, not only in his immigration policies, but in his ability to improve their everyday lives. Deportations, once framed as protecting the nation, are now seen by many as tearing apart families and communities. Economic policies, once sold as bold strategies, are now hitting voters in their wallets. Even Republicans, the backbone of Trump's power, are beginning to whisper doubts about where this path is heading. History tells us that when leaders push too far, too fast, the backlash can be swift and unforgiving. And that's the crossroads Trump now faces. He's achieved a level of dominance over his party that most politicians can only dream of. But in chasing victory after victory, has he set in motion the very forces that could undo him? That's the paradox of power. The higher you climb, the harder the fall can be. Trump may believe he's just getting started, but the numbers, the backlash, and the unease across the country suggest otherwise. To the question now isn't simply whether Trump can keep winning battles. It's whether his biggest battle for the trust of the American people has already begun slipping out his hands. And if these trends continue, we may look back at this moment not as the peak of his presidency, but as the start of his greatest political mistake.